Why we need servlets. In this chapter we will discuss about the need for servlets, Servlet, and its advantages. First of all, before we start with servlets, let's discuss about Common Gateway Interface, or CGI, and proprietary APIs for better understanding of servlets. In the early days of the World Wide Web, the Common Gateway Interface was used to allow web servers to process user input and serve dynamic content. We can develop CGI programs in any script or programming language, but Perl is the most common language. But CGI has many drawbacks. Let's look at them. Performance and scalability are major problems because a new process is created for each request, which leads to weakening the server. Of resources such as database connections between scripts or multiple calls to this same script leads to the repeated execution of expensive operations which weaken the server. Security is another big concern. Perl scripts normally use the shell command to execute OS, operating system, commands with the user-supplied data. For example, to send a mail, search for information in a file, etc. Use of a shell leads the way for a hacker to hack the passwords and use in illegal ways. To solve these problems, many web server vendors developed APIs, particularly Microsoft's ISAPI and Netscape's NSAPI. But the application developed by using these APIs works only on the particular server vendor. If we need to use that application to a server from another vendor, we have to start from the beginning. The problem using these is API is unreliable. These APIs typically support C/C++ code executing in the web server process. If the application crashes due to a bad pointer or division by 0, it brings the web server down. So the applications developed using these APIs are vendor-dependent and not reliable. What can we do now to develop applications, and what is the solution? Well, servlets became the solution for all the above, and the drawbacks and problems no longer exist. Let us see what servlet is in the next lesson. What is a servlet? Servlets are server-side Java programs used for generating dynamic web pages in response to the client requests. For example, if we take Yahoo Mail, they ask the login details to access our mailbox. Whenever we gave the details, it should be verified and it will give the suitable reply. Here, verification can be done by a servlet program. It is a simple example for servlet. Servlets are deployed in an application server or web server. Servlets are mainly used in web application development. For your better understanding, here is the most common ways of using a servlet. In this picture, a user requests some information by filling a form, doing certain processes through a servlet, and clicking the Submit button. The server identifies the requested servlet. The servlet then gathers the information needed to satisfy the user's request and develops a web page containing the information as a response. That response, i.e., resultant web page, is displayed on the user's browser. Well, now let us see some of the advantages of servlet. The first one is efficiency and scalable. Servlet reduces the execution time and avoids loading program for every request compared to CGI, Common Gateway Interface, which makes servlets efficient and scalable. Next, portability. Servlets are server and platform independent, i.e., once we write our servlet, we are able to deploy it in any server, and it has worked on various operating systems which make servlets portable and reusable. They are written in Java, so it should be powerful. The last one is robustness. Servlets are managed by Java Virtual Machine. There is no problem of memory leak or garbage collection, which helps us to write robust, i.e. strong applications. Generally, we are using HTTP protocol for several web applications. HTTP is a stateless protocol, but by using servlets we can maintain state across many server transactions by using cookies and many session management techniques provided by Servlet, which we will discuss later. I think now you've got a good idea about Servlet, its need and advantages. Next, we will discuss the life cycle of a servlet. Life cycle of a servlet. In previous lesson, we've discussed about the needs and benefits of Servlet. Now we will discuss the life cycle of Servlet and the methods involved in the life cycle. In Java.EE, all the processes are managed by the container. Web container provides the runtime environment for executing a servlet. Java Servlet invokes the init, service, and destroy methods using its life cycle. Let's have a glance of the working servlet. First, the container loads the servlet class and creates one or more instances of servlet. The init method is called automatically by the container when the Java servlet is loaded. Next, the container calls the service method whenever a request for the Java servlet is made, and it processes the client request. If the request is a HTTP request, it calls the particular do_XXX method, like do_get, do_post, associated with the request, i.e. get_post, to process the request. It sends back the response to the web container and waits for the new request. If the new request is for the same servlet, it creates a thread to process the request. Otherwise, it reloads the servlet. Finally, the container calls destroy method before the removal of servlet. Well, here is the diagrammatic illustration of the life cycle. The methods involved in Servlet lifecycle are defined in Servlet interface. Let us see some of these methods in detail. First one is init. In this method, we can define the initialization information and the statements that are needed to be executed by the servlet once. It should be loaded when the servlet loads into memory. It must be called before the servlet can service any requests. It is called only once in its entire life cycle. We can also override this method. In real-time applications, the init method is used to read server-specific initialization parameters, such as performance parameters, database settings, etc. Now you are seeing the structure of init method. The Servlet config interface contains the information about initialization parameters of a servlet. So, the web container creates an object of the servlet config and passes the object as parameter for init method. The init method throws a servlet exception if the container cannot initialize the servlet resources. Next, service. The service method is called whenever a request for the servlet is made. Inside this method, we can define the logic that services the client requests. If the request is a HTTP request, it calls the particular method to process the request as we have seen earlier. After processing the request, it sends back the response to the client. Let us see how the structure of a service method will be. The service method passes an object of servlet requests and servlet responses interfaces. Servlet request object contains information about the request made by the client. Servlet response object contains the response information that sends back to the client. It throws a servlet exception if anything interrupts the normal operation of the servlet, and throws I/O exception when an input or output operation is interrupted. Next, destroy. The destroy method is the last method to be called in the lifecycle of a servlet. This method removes the servlet from the server. We can override the destroy method and define any cleanup code that release resources, such as closing a database connection, etc., before removing the servlet from memory. This method is called only once in the lifecycle of a servlet. Here is the structure of destroy method. In the servlet interface, apart from these lifecycle methods, two other methods are available. They are getServletConfig and getServletInfo. GetServletConfig method provides the servletConfig object for initializing the parameters of servlet. GetServletInfo method is used for extracting the servlet metadata like author, servlet version, and other copyright information. If we want to know more about the servlet lifecycle methods, refer to the API documentation provided by Sun Microsystems in this link. Also, we can find the servlet documentation on Apache Software Foundation's website in this link.